Sometimes the coldest nights bring the warmest hearts together. Sometimes a stranger's kindness is the only thing standing between life and death. In the middle of a raging blizzard, 63-year-old widower Alden Croy finds two women stranded beside a broken car on a frozen back road. They're shivering, scared, and won't say who left them there. Alden has lived alone in his mountain cabin for years, keeping to himself since his wife passed. But tonight, he doesn't hesitate. He opens his truck door and brings them home. Over the next few days, the women slowly open up. They help around the cabin while Alden cooks meals and keeps the fire burning. Then the truth comes out. They're running from someone dangerous, and one of them is hiding a life-changing secret. What made this lonely widower risk everything for two strangers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light came pale and hesitant through the cabin windows, the kind of winter dawn that barely qualified as daylight at all. Alden Croy stood at the kitchen counter, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had belonged to his wife. The coffee inside had gone lukewarm while he stared out at the snow-laden pines that surrounded his property, their branches bowed under the weight of last night's storm. 5 years. 5 years since Margaret had passed. And still he reached for 2 mugs every morning before remembering. Still, he turned to speak to her about some small thing, the way the chickadees clustered at the feeder, or how the firewood was burning cleaner this year, before the silence reminded him she wasn't there to answer. The cabin sat 3 miles off the nearest maintained road, accessible only by a rutted track that became impassable for most of the winter. Alden had built the place himself 30 years ago, back when his hands were steadier, and Margaret would bring him lemonade while he worked, laughing at his insistence on doing everything the old way. No power lines, no gas connection, just a well, a wood stove, solar panels he'd installed a decade back, and the kind of quiet that most people couldn't tolerate for more than a day. He'd been an engineer once, working for a firm in Denver that designed bridges. Good work, honest work. But it had meant too much time away from home. When Margaret got sick, he'd retired early. They'd had 3 good years up here together before the cancer took her. Their son, Paxton, had wanted him to sell the place after she died, move closer to town, closer to people. But Alden couldn't imagine leaving. Every corner of this cabin held her the curtains she'd sewn, the bookshelf he'd built to her exact specifications, the garden plot where she'd grown tomatoes and herbs each summer. The cabin was small but well made, with thick log walls that held the heat and a stone fireplace that could warm the whole space on the coldest nights. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once, with a braided rug Margaret had made, covering the worn floorboards. A short hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with a composting toilet and a shower fed by a solar water heater. The back door opened onto a covered porch where Alden kept his tools, his woodpile, and a workbench that was usually covered in some project or another. He moved through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been alone a long time. Oatmeal on the stove, a spoonful of honey, a handful of walnuts he'd gathered last fall. He ate standing up, looking out the window at the thermometer mounted on the porch rail. 14 degrees. Cold, but not dangerously so. The storm had blown through in the night, leaving everything buried under a fresh foot of powder. After breakfast, he pulled on his insulated coveralls, his boots, his heavy canvas coat. The wood stove ate through fuel quickly in weather like this, and he needed to bring in more from the covered stack behind the cabin. The work was hard, splitting, hauling, stacking, but he welcomed it. It kept his body strong and his mind occupied. When his hands were busy, he could almost forget the emptiness that waited for him in the quiet moments. Outside, the cold hit him like a physical thing, sharp in his lungs and stinging on his cheeks. He worked steadily, carrying armload after armload of split pine and oak, stacking it neatly on the porch where it would stay dry. His breath came out in clouds. His shoulders ached the way they always did these days, a reminder that he was 63 and not getting any younger. He thought about Paxton while he worked. His son called every few weeks, dutifully checking in, but the conversations were always strained. Paxton had his own life, now a good job in Seattle, friends, a career that kept him busy. He'd stopped asking Alden to visit, stopped suggesting that maybe it was time to consider a place in town with other people around. The disappointment in his voice had faded into something worse. Resignation. Alden knew he'd pushed his son away after Margaret died. Knew he'd been short-tempered and distant during those first awful months when Paxton had tried so hard to help and Alden had wanted nothing but to be left alone with his grief. By the time he'd surfaced enough to realize what he'd done, the distance between them had solidified into something that felt permanent. He paused in his work, resting his gloved hands on the handle of his splitting maul. The woods around him were absolutely still, the snow muffling every sound. A raven called somewhere in the distance, its voice harsh and lonely. Alden understood that loneliness. He'd chosen it, built his life around it, and most days it felt like exactly what he deserved. Back inside, he shed his outer layers and fed the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. The cabin warmed quickly, that good dry heat that came from well-seasoned wood. He made himself a sandwich for lunch, venison from a deer he'd taken in the fall, bread he'd baked 3 days ago, mustard from a jar that was probably older than it should be. He ate slowly, methodically, tasting nothing. The afternoon stretched ahead of him the way every afternoon did, empty and endless. He could work on the rocking chair he was building, or read one of the books stacked beside his bed, or simply sit and watch the light change as the sun tracked across the southern sky. The routine of his days had become so ingrained that he moved through them without thinking, one activity bleeding into the next until it was time to sleep, and then wake and begin again. He found himself standing in the doorway of the spare bedroom, the one that had been Margaret's sewing room before her hands got too weak to hold a needle. It was tidy now, impersonal, with a single bed and a dresser and nothing else. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had slept in it. Paxton hadn't visited in over a year. In the wooden box on his nightstand, he kept Margaret's wedding ring. Sometimes he took it out and held it, remembering the weight of her hand in his, the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day with such absolute certainty. She'd known, even then, that he was the kind of man who would retreat into himself when things got hard. She'd loved him anyway, had spent 38 years coaxing him back into the world whenever he started to withdraw. Without her, he'd stopped trying. The world seemed too loud, too fast, too full of people who didn't understand that some losses couldn't be fixed with time or company or well-meaning advice. Up here, alone, he could exist without pretending to be fine. He could miss her without someone telling him it was time to move on. The light was fading early, the way it did in deep winter. Alden moved through the cabin, turning on the few battery-powered lamps he allowed himself, their soft glow pushing back the darkness just enough. He started a pot of soup on the stove, potatoes, carrots, onions, the last of the ham from the freezer. It would last him 3 days if he was careful. He was stirring the pot when the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows in their frames. The weather report on his battery radio that morning had mentioned another storm coming through, though Alden had learned not to trust those predictions too much. Mountain weather did what it wanted, regardless of what the forecasters said. He ate his soup at the table, the chair across from him empty as always. Outside, the wind continued to build, and he could hear the first spatter of sleet against the glass. It was going to be a rough night. He added more wood to the fire and checked the flashlights, making sure the batteries were fresh. Then he settled into his reading chair with a book he'd read 3 times before, letting the familiar words wash over him, while the storm began to howl. He had no way of knowing that in a few hours everything would change, that the isolation he'd built so carefully around himself was about to crack open, letting in a cold that had nothing to do with the weather and a warmth he'd thought he'd never feel again. The decision to go out in the storm was born from necessity, not choice. Alden had realized around 8 that evening that he'd forgotten to bring in the extra propane tank from the shed, and with the temperature dropping fast, he'd need it before morning. The wind was fierce now, driving snow horizontal across the clearing, but he'd been through worse. He pulled on his heavy parka, wrapped a scarf across his face, and pushed out into the howling darkness. The cold was immediate and brutal, finding every gap in his clothing. He kept his head down and moved by memory more than sight, following the path he'd walked 1,000 times to the storage shed behind the cabin. The propane tank was right, where he'd left it, and he hefted it with a grunt, feeling the weight pull at his lower back. Getting old, he thought, and not gracefully. He was halfway back to the cabin when he decided to take the long way around and check the main road gate. It was probably buried in snow by now, but something instinct, habit, he couldn't say, pulled him toward his truck instead. The old Ford was parked under a rough shelter he'd built years ago, and it started on the 3rd try despite the cold. He let it warm for a minute, then backed out carefully onto the track that led down to the county road. The drive was treacherous, the truck's headlights barely cutting through the swirling white. Twice he had to stop and get out to clear snow from the windshield. He was questioning his own sanity, wondering why he'd thought this was necessary when his headlights caught something that didn't belong. A car, dark and silent, pulled half off the road where the county route curved sharply. Its headlights were still on but fading, casting a weak yellow glow into the storm. Alden slowed, his heart rate picking up. This far out, this late, in this weather, whoever was in that car was in serious trouble. He pulled up behind it and grabbed his heavy flashlight from under the seat. The wind nearly knocked him sideways when he stepped out. He approached the car carefully, his boots crunching in the deep snow, and shone his light through the driver's window. 2 faces stared back at him, pale and terrified. They were women, he could see that much. The one in the driver's seat was older, maybe late 20s, with dark hair plastered to her face. The passenger was younger, early 20s perhaps, wrapped in a thin jacket that was wholly inadequate for the conditions. Both were shivering violently, their breath fogging the windows. Alden knocked on the glass, and the driver flinched hard, her hands coming up defensively. He stepped back, holding his light down so it wouldn't blind them, and made a rolling motion with his hand. After a long moment, the window came down an inch. "You can't stay here," he said, loud enough to be heard over the wind. "You'll freeze to death." "We're fine," the older woman said, though her chattering teeth made a liar of her. "Someone's coming for us." "When?" She didn't answer. "This road doesn't get plowed until morning at the earliest," Alden said. "Could be noon before they get out here. You won't make it that long. Not in this cold." The younger woman in the passenger seat was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks. She had her arms wrapped around herself, and even through the window, Alden could see she was pregnant, not just a little, but significantly, maybe 6 or 7 months along. "I have a place up the mountain," he said. "It's warm, and it's safe. You can wait there." "We don't know you," the driver said. But there was desperation creeping into her voice now. "No, you don't. But I'm not the one who's going to kill you. Tonight. This cold is." It was harsh, but it was true, and he could see the moment she accepted it. She looked at the younger woman, some silent communication passing between them, and then back at Alden. "Our car won't start," she said quietly. "Leave it. I'll bring you back in the morning if you want." Another long pause. The younger woman nodded slightly, and the driver closed her eyes as if gathering herself for a leap off a cliff. "Okay," she said. Getting them into his truck was an ordeal. They were both hypothermic, moving slowly and clumsily, and the pregnant girl nearly fell in the snow. Alden caught her elbow and felt how thin she was beneath the jacket, how she was trembling in a way that had nothing to do with temperature alone. Fear, he thought. They were both terrified, and not just of the cold. He settled them in the cab, cranked the heat up as high as it would go, and turned the truck around. Neither woman spoke during the drive back up the mountain. The older one sat, rigid in the middle seat, her arm around the younger one, both of them staring straight ahead like prisoners being transported. Alden didn't try to make conversation. Whatever they were running from, whatever had landed them on a deserted mountain road in a blizzard, they'd tell him, or they wouldn't. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting them warm and dry. The cabin looked small and humble when they pulled up, just a dark shape with warm light glowing in the windows. Alden parked under the shelter and helped them out, guiding them through the snow to the front door. They shuffled inside like refugees, dripping melted snow onto Margaret's braided rug, and stood there, shivering, while Alden closed the door against the wind. "Bathroom's down the hall," he said, shrugging out of his own coat. "There's towels in the cabinet, and I'll find you some dry clothes. Get out of those wet things before you catch pneumonia." They didn't move, just stood there watching him with huge eyes. "I'm Alden," he said, making his voice as gentle as he could manage. "Alden Croy. This is my place. You're safe here." "Bryn," the older woman said finally. "This is Kendra." The younger one, Kendra, nodded but didn't speak. Up close, in the light, Alden could see she was even younger than he'd thought. 22 at most, with a round face that should have been pretty but was drawn and exhausted. The pregnancy was obvious now, her belly a distinct swell beneath the soaked jacket. "Well, Bryn and Kendra," Alden said, "first thing is to get you warm. Then I'll make some soup, and we'll go from there. Sound fair?" Bryn nodded slowly, her arm still protective around her sister, because they had to be sisters. The resemblance was clear once you looked for it. Alden showed them to the bathroom, gave them towels, and a couple of his own flannel shirts that would be huge on them, but dry and warm. While they changed, he heated up the leftover soup from dinner and made a pot of strong tea. His hands moved automatically, but his mind was working. Who leaves two women on a mountain road in a blizzard? Not someone who cared about their welfare. That was certain. And the way they'd flinched when he knocked on the window, the fear that still lingered in their eyes. They weren't just cold and stranded. They were running from something or someone. When they emerged from the bathroom wearing his shirts like dresses, he had the soup ready and the fire built up high. They sat at his table, the one he'd eaten at alone for 5 years, and wrapped their hands around the warm bowls. For a long time, the only sound was the spoons against ceramic and the wind howling outside. "Thank you," Bryn said finally, her voice rough. "You didn't have to stop." "Yes, I did," Alden said simply. "No one deserves to freeze to death on a back road." Kendra started crying again, quiet tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. Bryn put her hand over her sister's, and Alden looked away, giving them what privacy he could in the small space. Outside, the storm raged on, and inside, 3 strangers sat together in the warmth, none of them knowing yet how their lives had just become intertwined. The first night passed in careful silence. Alden set them up in the spare bedroom with extra blankets he pulled from the closet, blankets that still smelled faintly of cedar and Margaret's lavender sachets. He showed them where everything was, the bathroom, the kitchen, the wood stove they should stay away from if they weren't used to managing fire. They nodded at everything he said but volunteered nothing about themselves, and he didn't ask. He heard them whispering behind the closed door after he'd said goodnight, their voices too low to make out words but high with tension. He lay in his own bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what he'd invited into his home and whether he was a fool for not pressing them for answers. But something about the fear in their eyes, the protective way Bryn had held her sister, told him that pushing would only drive them deeper into silence. Morning came grey and cold, the storm finally blown out but leaving everything buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Alden woke early as always and started coffee, moving quietly so as not to wake his guests. He was surprised when Bryn appeared in the kitchen doorway while the sun was still just a pale suggestion in the east. "Couldn't sleep," she said, hovering at the threshold as if uncertain whether she was allowed to enter. "Coffee's almost ready," Alden said. "You take it black or with something in it." "Black is fine." She sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap while he poured 2 cups. Up close in the morning light, he could see she was probably 29 or 30, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of more than one sleepless night. There were faint bruises on her wrists, yellowish-green and fading, the kind that came from someone gripping too hard. He set the coffee in front of her and took his own seat across the table, giving her space. "Kendra's still asleep," Bryn said after a long silence. "She needs it. The baby, it takes a lot out of her. When's she due?" "March. Middle of March," they said. Bryn wrapped her hands around the mug, seeking its warmth. This wasn't planned. Any of this." Alden nodded, sipping his own coffee. Outside, a chickadee landed on the feeder he kept stocked, its small body fluffing against the cold. "The car," Bryn said hesitantly. "If you could take us back to it today, we could—" "Battery's dead by now," Alden said, not unkindly. "Even if it wasn't, you won't get far. Road's not ploughed, and with this much snow, it won't be for a couple of days at least." He saw her shoulders sag slightly, though whether from relief or despair, he couldn't tell. "You're welcome to stay until the road's clear," he continued. "I've got plenty of food, plenty of wood, no reason you should be uncomfortable." "We can't pay you," she said quietly. "Didn't ask you to." She looked at him then. Really looked, as if trying to puzzle out what kind of man picks up strangers in a blizzard and asks nothing in return. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. Alden considered the question, turning his mug in his hands. "Because I was there," he said finally. "Because you needed help. Doesn't seem more complicated than that." Kendra emerged an hour later, moving slowly and holding her lower back the way pregnant women do. She was even younger in daylight, with a round face and eyes that were red from crying. Alden made them breakfast eggs from his chickens, toast, more coffee, and they ate like people who hadn't had a proper meal in days. "This is really good," Kendra said softly. It was the first time he'd heard her speak beyond a whispered thank you the night before. "Simple food," Alden said, "but it's warm." After breakfast, Bryn insisted on washing the dishes. Alden didn't argue, just showed her where things went and left her to it while he pulled on his coat to tend to the morning chores. When he came back in with an armload of firewood, he found both women in the main room, Kendra sitting in the chair by the window and Bryn examining the books on his shelf. "You've read all of these?" Bryn asked. "Most of them. Some were my wife's." "Were?" "She passed 5 years ago." The words still came hard, even after all this time. Bryn's expression softened with something that looked like understanding. "I'm sorry," she said, and it sounded genuine. The day unfolded slowly, all 3 of them moving carefully around each other, like people learning a new dance. Alden worked on splitting more wood, and when he came inside around noon, he found Bryn had tidied the kitchen and Kendra had folded the blankets they'd used. Small gestures, but they meant something. He made lunch soup again, with bread he'd baked earlier in the week, and this time the meal felt less strained. Kendra asked about the chickens, whether they needed tending, and when Alden said yes, she offered to help. He almost said no, worried about her condition, but something in her eyes made him reconsider. "Bundle up, warm," he said. "It's cold out there." She smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her face, and he caught a glimpse of who she might be when she wasn't running scared. They went out together, Kendra moving carefully through the snow in boots Alden had found for her. Margaret's old ones, too big, but serviceable. She scattered feed for the chickens and laughed when one of them landed on her shoulder, and for a moment she looked like any young woman enjoying a winter morning. "They're sweet," she said, watching the birds peck at the ground. "I always wanted chickens." "They're good company," Alden agreed. "Not much for conversation, but they don't judge." When they came back inside, Bryn had found Margaret's old knitting basket and was examining a bill, half-finished scarf with careful hands. "I used to knit," she said. "Before." She stopped, catching herself. A long time ago. You're welcome to finish it, Alden said. Been sitting there for 5 years. Might as well be useful to someone. That evening, after dinner, they sat together in the main room while the fire crackled and the darkness pressed against the windows. Alden pulled out a piece of oak he'd been saving and started sketching measurements on it with a carpenter's pencil. Bryn noticed immediately. "What are you making?" she asked. "Cradle," he said simply. "Figured the baby will need somewhere to sleep." The silence that followed was profound. Kendra's hand went to her belly, and her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed different, somehow less desperate, more something else he couldn't quite name. "You don't have to do that," Bryn said, her voice tight. "I know. We're strangers. For now," Alden said, continuing his sketch. "But you're here, and the baby's coming, whether we know each other or not. Seems practical to me." He didn't look up, didn't want to see their faces and whatever complicated emotions were playing across them. He just kept drawing, the scratch of pencil on wood the only sound besides the fire. Later, after they'd gone to bed, he stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit snow. Margaret's wedding ring was in his hand, warm from being held. He thought about what she would say if she could see him now, harboring 2 frightened women he knew almost nothing about, building a cradle for a baby that wasn't his concern. She'd probably laugh at him, that soft laugh she'd had that meant she was pleased he was finally doing something right. She'd always said he had too much room in his heart and too much fear about using it. Maybe she'd been right. He put the ring back in its box and crawled into bed, listening to the old house settle around him. For the first time in 5 years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. 3 days became a week, and the initial wariness began to thaw like ice in spring sunshine. The roads remained buried under snow, the county plough having prioritized the main routes closer to town. Alden didn't mind. The company, strange as it was, had begun to feel less like an intrusion and more like something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Routines developed naturally. Bryn proved to be an early riser like Alden, and they'd share the quiet morning hours over coffee, talking about small things, the weather, the wildlife, books they'd both read. She was careful with her words, never revealing too much, but Alden learned she'd been a nurse before whatever had sent them running. Her hands were steady and competent when she helped him reorganize the chaotic collection of first aid supplies he kept in the bathroom cabinet. "You've got enough medical gear here to run a small clinic," she said, sorting through bandages and antibiotics. "But it's all jumbled together. You'd never find what you needed in an emergency." "Never needed to," Alden said. "Don't get hurt much these days." "These days," she repeated, glancing at the scars on his hands, old burns from welding, a thick line across his thumb from a sore that had kicked back 20 years ago. "What about before?" "Before I was more careless." She smiled at that, a real smile that made her look younger. She had a good face, he thought, strong and intelligent, the kind of face that had seen hardship but hadn't let it make her bitter. Kendra was slower to warm, but she gravitated toward the workshop where Alden spent his afternoons. She'd stand in the doorway watching him work, and eventually she started asking questions. What kind of wood was he using? Why did he choose that particular joint? Could she try? He set her up with a piece of soft pine and a basic set of tools, showing her how to hold the chisel, how to let the blade do the work instead of forcing it. Her first attempts were clumsy, but she had patience and a good eye. Within a few days, she was carving small flowers into the practice piece, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. "You're a natural," Alden said, watching her work. She blushed with pleasure. "My dad used to do woodworking. Before." She stopped abruptly, the light leaving her eyes. "Before what?" Alden asked gently. But she just shook her head and went back to carving, and he didn't push. The cradle took shape slowly under his hands. He'd chosen cherry wood, smooth and fine-grained, and he worked the joints with care, fitting each piece so precisely that no glue would be needed. It was old-fashioned work, the kind that took time and attention, and he found himself thinking about Margaret as he worked. She would have loved this, the purpose of it, the hope implied in building something for new life. One evening, after a dinner of venison stew and fresh bread, Bryn helped him clear the table while Kendra dozed in the chair by the fire. The younger woman had been tired lately, sleeping more, and though Alden wasn't a doctor, he wondered if that was normal for pregnancy or something to worry about. "She's okay," Bryn said quietly, following his gaze. "Just exhausted. The stress, it's been hard on her." "What kind of stress?" Alden asked, drying a plate. Bryn was quiet for a long moment, her hands still in the dishwater. "The kind that comes from making hard choices," she said finally. "From being scared all the time." "Of what?" "Of making the wrong decision. Of hurting someone you love by trying to protect them." She pulled her hands from the water, reaching for a towel. "Of trusting the wrong person." Alden could see her struggling with how much to say, and he waited, giving her space to find her words. "Our stepfather," she said at last. "He's not a good man. When Kendra got pregnant, he wanted her to give the baby up, said it would ruin her life, ruin the family reputation. He got violent about it." "And the father? The baby's father?" "Gone," Bryn said, and there was bitterness in her voice now. "Ran the moment things got complicated. So it was just us and him, and when he started talking about forcing the issue, about making arrangements without Kendra's consent, we knew we had to leave." "Where were you trying to go?" "We have a cousin in Wyoming. She said we could stay with her until the baby came, help us get on our feet. But the car broke down, and then—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the cabin, the storm, everything that had led them here. "And the man who was supposed to meet you—" Bryn's face hardened. "Never showed. I don't know if he couldn't get through the storm or if he changed his mind. Either way, we were stuck." Alden dried another plate, thinking. "This stepfather," he said, "is he looking for you?" "Probably. But he doesn't know where we went. We were careful. Careful isn't the same as safe." "I know." She met his eyes. "But it's all we've got right now." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and Kendra stirred in her sleep, one hand moving protectively to her belly. Alden thought about his own son, about the distance he'd allowed to grow between them, and he felt a familiar ache in his chest. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. "Both of you. No one's going to find you here, and even if they did, they'd have to go through me first." Bryn's eyes shone with sudden tears. "Why would you do that? You don't know us. This isn't your problem." "Maybe not," Alden said. "But I've got room and you need it. Seems simple enough to me." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "You're a good man, Alden Croy." "Just a man," he said, "doing what seems right." Later that night, alone in his room, he found himself holding Margaret's ring again, turning it over in his fingers. He could almost hear her voice, teasing him about getting soft in his old age, about letting strangers into his carefully constructed solitude. But there would be warmth in her teasing, approval in her eyes. The phone rang then, startling him, the landline he kept for emergencies, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. He picked it up to hear Paxton's voice, uncertain and distant. "Dad? You okay out there? I heard about the storm." "I'm fine," Alden said. "More than fine, actually." "You sound different." Alden looked toward the closed door, beyond which two women slept in the room that had been empty for so long. "I've got company," he said, "two women who needed help. They're staying for a bit." The silence on the other end was profound. Then, "Company? You?" "Things change," Alden said simply. They talked for a few more minutes, awkward but less strained than usual, and when Alden hung up, he felt something loosen in his chest. Not everything was fixed, not with Paxton, not with his own grief, but maybe it didn't have to be. Maybe forward motion was enough, even if the destination wasn't clear. He put the ring away and turned off the light. listening to the cabins settle around him. 3 people under one roof, all of them carrying their own hurts, their own fears. But together, somehow, it felt less heavy than being alone. The second week brought a shift in the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. The women moved through the cabin with more confidence now, no longer asking permission for every small thing. Kendra had claimed the rocking chair by the window as her spot, and she'd sit there for hours working on the embroidery project Bryn had started for the baby. Tiny flowers and birds stitched onto soft white fabric. Bryn had reorganized the entire kitchen, grouping things logically in a way that actually made sense, and Alden found himself grateful every time he reached for something and found it exactly where it should be. They were becoming a household, he realized. Not a family. That word felt too presumptuous, but something more than strangers sharing. Space. They had rhythms now, small accommodations they made for each other without discussion. Alden kept the fire going through the night because Kendra got cold easily. Bryn made sure there was always fresh coffee ready when he came in from morning chores. Kendra saved him the newspaper's crossword puzzle from the weekly delivery, knowing he enjoyed it with his afternoon tea. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that the radio crackled to life unexpectedly. Alden kept an old CB unit in the corner, mostly unused, but occasionally picking up chatter from truckers on the highway or hunters in the woods. This time, the voice that came through was closer, clearer. Anyone near Pinewood Ridge, be advised there's a silver Dodge sedan abandoned on County Road 47, owner unknown. If anyone has information. Bryn went rigid, her hand frozen halfway to her coffee cup. Kendra looked up from her embroidery, her face draining of color. Alden reached over and switched off the radio. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. He could see them both struggling with whether to acknowledge what they'd heard, whether to explain, whether to run. Finally, Bryn spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "That's our car. Figured as much. Someone reported it. County does regular patrols, even in winter. They would have found it eventually." Alden kept his tone neutral, unthreatening. "Question is, what do you want to do about it?" Kendra's hands twisted in the fabric she'd been working on. "He'll know," she whispered. "If they run the plates, he'll know where we were." "County Road 47 covers about 60 miles, Alden said. "Even if he knows you were in this area, that's a lot of ground to search, and most of it isn't accessible this time of year." "You don't know him," Kendra said, and there was real fear in her voice now. "He doesn't give up. He never gives up." Bryn moved to her sister's side, putting an arm around her shoulders. "We should go," she said to Alden. "We've put you in danger long enough." "Go where?" Alden asked reasonably. "In what vehicle? And to do what, lead him right to your cousin's place? We'll figure something out. Or you could stay put, let this blow over, and make a plan that actually makes sense." Bryn shook her head. "You don't understand. Our stepfather Vernon, he has connections. He knows people. If he finds out we're here, then he'll have to deal with me." Alden said simply. "You're one man," Bryn said, frustration creeping into her voice. He's connected. He has money, influence. People owe him favors." "Maybe so. But this is my property, my home, and I decide who's welcome here. Anyone who comes looking for you will have to answer to me first, and I don't care how many favors they're owed." Kendra started crying, quiet tears that she tried to hide by bowing her head over her embroidery. Alden felt something tighten in his chest, the same protective instinct that had made him stop on that storm-dark road, but stronger now, more personal. "Listen to me," he said, his voice gentler. "I'm not saying there's no danger. I'm saying running scared without a plan isn't the answer. You're safe here, at least for now. Use that safety to think, to prepare. Don't throw it away because you're frightened. But if he comes, we deal with it. Together." He looked between them, seeing the doubt and hope warring on their faces. "I've lived alone for 5 years, because I chose to. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how to stand up for what's right." And leaving 2 women and an unborn baby to face a violent man alone, that's not something I could live with. The words hung in the air, more of a commitment than he'd intended to make, but true nonetheless. Margaret would have done the same, would have opened their home and their hearts without hesitation. He'd spent 5 years trying to wall himself off from that kind of vulnerability, but apparently some lessons ran too deep to be forgotten. Bryn studied his face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "We'll stay. For now." That evening, the mood was somber despite Alden's attempts at normalcy. He made dinner, roasted chicken with root vegetables, and they ate mostly in silence. Afterward, while Bryn cleaned up, Alden went out to his workshop and came back with something he'd kept hidden under a tarp. "This was my wife's," he said, setting a wooden box on the table. "Her recipe collection, 40 years of cooking, all written down on index cards." Kendra looked up at him, her eyes still red from crying. "Why are you showing us this?" "Because I want you to have it," Alden said. "When you leave here, when you start your new life, wherever that takes you, you'll need to feed that baby, teach them to cook eventually. These recipes, they're good ones, practical. The kind of food that sticks to your ribs and makes a house feel like home." Bryn opened the box with careful hands, pulling out cards covered in Margaret's neat handwriting. "We can't take this," she said softly. "It's too much. It's your wife's. Was my wife's. Now it's yours. If you want it." She would have liked that, knowing her recipes were being used, not just sitting in a box, gathering dust. Kendra reached out and touched one of the cards, tracing the faded ink with her fingertip. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. Thank me by using them," Alden said, "and by being safe. That's all I ask." Later, after they'd gone to bed, Alden stood on the front porch, looking out at the dark woods. The temperature had dropped, and his breath came out in clouds. Somewhere out there, a man was probably looking for these women, angry and determined. Alden thought about what he'd said earlier, about standing between them and danger, and he wondered if he'd been foolish to make such a promise. But then he thought about Kendra's tears, about the way Bryn had looked at him with something like hope, and he knew he'd do it again. He'd spent 5 years hiding from life, from connection, from anything that might hurt him the way losing Margaret had hurt. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. He went back inside and locked the door, checking the windows out of habit. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out the old shotgun from the back of his bedroom closet, cleaned it, loaded it, and set it within easy reach, just in case. Because protecting yourself was one thing, but protecting people who needed you, that was something else entirely. That was what Margaret would call worth living for. The discovery came by accident, as most unsettling truths do. Alden was moving some of the women's belongings to make room for the finished cradle when he found it a small leather journal that had slipped between the bed and the wall in the spare room. He picked it up, intending to return it immediately, but the journal fell open in his hands, and a single line caught his eye before he could look away. "I don't know if Percy will ever forgive me for leaving without telling him. Percy," a name he'd never heard mentioned before. Alden closed the journal quickly, his face heating with shame at having read even that much. He set it on the dresser where it would be found and left the room, but the name stayed with him, raising questions he had no right to ask. At dinner that night, he watched Kendra more carefully than he had before. She was quiet, picking at her food, one hand resting on her belly, as it often did now. The baby had started moving visibly, small ripples across her shirt that made her smile sometimes and wince others. But tonight, she just looked sad. "I found a journal in the spare room," Alden said finally, unable to help himself. "Didn't read it, but I put it back on the dresser for whoever lost it." Bryn's fork clattered against her plate. Kendra's face went pale. "It's mine," Kendra said quietly. "Thank you for respecting my privacy." Wouldn't be right to read someone's personal thoughts, Alden said. But I did see one name. Just happened to catch my eye before I closed it. The silence stretched thin and taut between them. Finally, Bryn spoke, her voice tight with something like anger. Percy is the baby's father, she said. The man who abandoned Kendra when things got difficult. I didn't know you were still in contact with him, Bryn continued, turning to her sister. After everything he did. He didn't abandon me, Kendra said, and there was steel in her voice that Alden hadn't heard before. He wanted to stay. Vernon threatened him, said he'd destroy his career, his family. Percy didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Not everyone has your courage, Bryn. Kendra's eyes were bright with tears now. Percy was scared. Vernon made it clear what would happen if he didn't leave. And Percy, he's not like you. He's not brave. But that doesn't mean he doesn't care. Alden raised his hands, trying to calm the storm brewing between the sisters. This isn't my business. You're right, it's not, Bryn said sharply. Then, seeing his expression, she softened. I'm sorry. That was unfair. You've been nothing but kind to us. It's just, Kendra wiped at her eyes. I've been texting him. Not often. Just letting him know I'm alive. That the baby's okay. He deserves to know that much. With what phone? Bryn demanded. We don't have phones. Kendra reached into her pocket and pulled out a small flip phone, the cheap kind you could buy with cash at any convenience store. I bought it before we left, just in case. I know you didn't want me to contact him, but I couldn't let him think we'd disappeared forever. Bryn stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? If Vernon traces those messages, he won't. Percy's been careful. He got a burner phone too. And you trust him? After he left you? He's the father of my baby. Kendra's voice cracked. And maybe he made mistakes, but so did we. We all did what we thought we had to do to survive, Vernon. Alden watched the two sisters face each other across the table, years of complicated history playing out in their expressions. He thought about his own son, about the misunderstandings and hurt feelings that had built up between them, and he felt a deep sympathy for both women. Sit down, he said quietly. Both of you. Something in his tone made them obey. He waited until they were settled, then spoke in the measured way he remembered Margaret using when they'd fought about something important. Seems to me, he said, that you're both scared, and you're both trying to protect each other, and that's causing more problems than it solves. Bryn, you're worried about your sister's safety. Kendra, you're worried about keeping a connection to your baby's father. Both of those are reasonable concerns. But, Bryn started, let me finish. The question isn't whether Kendra should be in contact with Percy. That's her choice, and she's an adult. The question is whether that contact puts all of us at risk, and if so, what we do about it. Kendra twisted the phone in her hands. Percy wants to help. He's been trying to find us, to figure out a way to be part of this. Part of the baby's life. And you believe him? Alden asked. Not unkindly. I do. I know how it looks, but I love him. And I think he loves me. He just didn't know how to stand up to Vernon. Bryn made a frustrated sound, but Alden saw pain in her eyes too. I'm just trying to keep you safe, she said to her sister. That's all I've ever tried to do. I know, Kendra said softly, and I love you for it. But I can't cut Percy out completely. This baby deserves to know their father, and Percy deserves a chance to be the man he wants to be, instead of the one Vernon tried to make him. Alden let the words settle for a moment, then asked the practical question. Is this Percy a good man, aside from the running away part? Kendra nodded emphatically. He is. He works hard. He's kind. He wanted to marry me before Vernon found out about the pregnancy. He had a ring. And everything. And if he could find a way to help now, safely, would you want that? Yes, Kendra whispered. More than anything. Bryn's jaw was tight, but she didn't argue. Alden could see her struggling between her protective instincts and her desire to see her sister happy. "Then maybe," Alden said carefully, "we should consider bringing him here, under controlled circumstances. Let him prove himself. Let Bryn see he's trustworthy, and let Kendra have what she needs. This baby's coming in a couple of months, and it would be better if everyone involved was on the same page before that happens." "You'd let him come here?" Kendra asked, hope lighting up her face. "If we do it carefully. If he's willing to follow our rules and if Bryn agrees to at least give him a chance." Alden looked at the older sister. "What do you say? Can you do that?" Bryn closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were resigned. "If Kendra wants this, then yes, I'll give him a chance. But if he hurts her again, if he puts any of us in danger, then he'll answer to both of us," Alden said firmly. The rest of the evening passed in careful planning. They discussed how to arrange a meeting, what precautions to take, how to make sure Vernon couldn't trace Percy's movements. Kendra's relief was palpable, and even Bryn seemed to relax slightly once they had a concrete plan. Later, after the women had gone to bed, Alden sat in his chair by the fire, thinking about trust and second chances. He'd given Margaret a second chance once, after a fight early in their marriage, when he'd been stubborn and wrong. She'd given him countless chances to be better than he was, to rise above his instinct to withdraw. Maybe that was what love was, not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to work through them together. He pulled out his phone, and before he could talk himself out of it, called Paxton. "Dad?" His son's voice was surprised. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Alden said. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry for pushing you away after your mother died, for being too hard to reach, too stubborn to accept help. You deserved better from me." The silence on the other end lasted so long that Alden thought the call had dropped. Then Paxton's voice came through, thick with emotion. "I missed you, Dad, the real you, not the ghost you became." "I missed me too," Alden said. "But I think I'm finding my way back, with some unexpected help." They talked for nearly an hour, the longest conversation they'd had in years. And when Alden finally hung up, he felt lighter somehow, as if he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. The arrangements were made carefully over the following days. Percy would drive up from Colorado, where he'd been staying with a friend, taking back roads to avoid any possibility of being followed. They set the meeting for a Saturday afternoon, giving them time to prepare and giving Percy time to make the journey safely. Kendra was nervous but excited, checking the window every few minutes as the day approached. Bryn remained skeptical but had agreed to keep an open mind. The morning of Percy's arrival, Alden woke early to find Kendra already in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she tried to make coffee. "He'll be here in a few hours," she said, though Alden hadn't asked. What if he changed his mind? What if he decides this is too much? "Then he's not the man you think he is," Alden said gently. "But if he drives all this way in winter weather just to see you, that says something about his commitment." She nodded, but her anxiety was palpable. Bryn emerged from the bedroom looking tired, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept well. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. By noon, they'd cleaned the cabin 3 times and rearranged the furniture twice. Alden finally suggested they all take a breath and sit down before they wore themselves out. They were sitting at the table drinking tea when they heard the sound of tires crunching on the snowy drive. Kendra stood so fast her chair toppled backward. She pressed her hands to her face, then to her belly, then reached for Bryn's hand. Alden moved to the window and looked out, seeing a modest sedan pulling up to the cabin. A young man emerged, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair and an anxious expression. "That's him," Kendra breathed. Alden opened the door before Percy could knock, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. He wanted to get a measure of the man, see what he was made of. Percy stopped a few feet away, his hands visible and empty. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I'm Percy Whitmore. Thank you for letting me come here. Haven't decided if I'm glad you're here yet, Alden said. But come inside. It's cold. Percy stepped into the cabin, his eyes immediately finding Kendra. The look that passed between them was so raw, so full of longing and relief, that Alden felt like an intruder. Percy moved forward as if pulled by a magnet, stopping just short of touching her. "You're okay," he said, his voice breaking. "I was so worried when you disappeared, I thought." "I'm okay," Kendra said. "We're okay. The baby's okay. Can I?" He gestured helplessly toward her belly. She nodded, taking his hand and placing it where the baby was moving. Percy's eyes filled with tears, and he sank to his knees in front of her, pressing his forehead against her stomach. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't strong enough to stand up to him. I should have protected you. I should have—" "Stop," Kendra said, running her fingers through his hair. "You're here now. That's what matters." Bryn made a small sound, something between a scoff and a sob, and left the room. Alden followed her, giving the young couple their moment. He found her in the workshop, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the finished cradle without really seeing it. "That's hard to watch," Alden said quietly. Bryn's voice was thick. "I want to believe him. I want to believe he's changed, that he'll be there for her. But I saw her when he left, Alden. She was destroyed. And if he does that again, he might," Alden said honestly. "People fail each other. It's part of being human. But people also grow up, find their courage, learn from their mistakes. Question is whether you can give him the chance to prove which kind of person he is." Bryn wiped at her eyes. "She loves him. That's plain enough. And he seems to love her. Also plain." She turned to look at him. "You think I'm being too hard on him? I think you're being a good sister. But maybe being a good sister right now means stepping back and letting Kendra make her own choices, even if you're scared of what might happen." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Bryn straightened her shoulders. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's go back in." When they returned to the main room, Percy and Kendra were sitting together on the couch, his arm around her shoulders, both of them talking quietly. They looked up as Alden and Bryn entered, and Percy stood immediately, facing Bryn directly. "I know you have every reason not to trust me," he said. "I know I failed Kendra when she needed me most. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again. I want to marry her, if she'll have me. I want to be a father to our child. I've left my job, left everything behind, because none of it matters without them." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "I bought this 6 months ago. Before everything fell apart. I've been carrying it ever since, hoping I'd get the chance to ask properly." Kendra's hand went to her mouth, fresh tears streaming down her face. Percy got down on one knee, right there in Alden's cabin, and took Kendra's hand. "I know I don't deserve you. I know I hurt you, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for that if you let me. But I love you, Kendra. I've loved you since the day we met. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Kendra said, pulling him up and into her arms. "Yes, yes, yes." The ring slipped onto her finger as if it had always belonged there, and Percy kissed her with the kind of desperate relief that comes from nearly losing everything that matters. Bryn was crying now too, and even Alden felt his throat tighten. But the moment was interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze, the crunch of tires on snow, moving fast. Alden moved to the window and felt his blood run cold. A large black pickup truck was barreling up the drive, and even from a distance, he could see the anger in the way it moved. "Who else knew you were coming here?" Alden asked Percy sharply. Percy had gone white. "No one. I swear I was so careful." "Did you check your car? Your phone? Did you make sure you weren't followed?" Percy looked stricken. "I got a new phone. I took back roads. I can't avile." But Alden was already moving, pulling the shotgun from where he'd kept it near the door. "Get away from the windows," he ordered, Everyone in the back bedroom now. What's happening? Kendra asked, her voice high with panic. Bryn had already figured it out. Her face was ashen. Vernon, she said. He found us. The truck pulled to a stop outside, and a large man climbed out. He was in his 50s, well-built, with a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't twisted with fury. He strode toward the cabin like he owned it, and Alden stepped out onto the porch to meet him, the shotgun held low but ready. "That's far enough," Alden called out. Vernon stopped, his eyes taking in the gun, the cabin, and Alden himself. Then he smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "You must be the good Samaritan who's been harboring my daughters," Vernon said, his voice smooth and cold. "I appreciate you keeping them safe, but I'll be taking them home now." "They're not your daughters," Alden said. "They're grown women, and they don't want to go with you. What they want is irrelevant. Kendra is carrying my grandchild, and I have a responsibility." "You have no rights here," Alden interrupted. "This is my property and you're trespassing. I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff." Vernon's smile widened. "The sheriff is a friend of mine. Plays poker with me every Thursday. I don't think he'll be much help to you." Behind Alden, he heard the door open and felt, rather than saw Bryn step out onto the porch. "Go away, Vernon," she said, her voice steady despite the fear he could hear underneath. "We're not coming back." "Bryn, sweetheart, don't be difficult. This has gone on long enough. Kendra needs proper medical care, and that baby needs to be born in a hospital, not some backwoods cabin." "I'm an RN," Bryn said. "I can provide better care than you ever did." Vernon's expression hardened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. That baby is my flesh and blood. That baby is mine," a new voice said, and Percy stepped out onto the porch beside Bryn. "And Kendra's—" "You have no claim here." Vernon's face went purple with rage. "You," he spat. "I told you what would happen if you came back. I told you I'd destroy you." "Then destroy me," Percy said, and Alden was surprised by the steel in the young man's voice. "But you're not touching Kendra or our child. I've already contacted a lawyer. I have documentation of your threats, recordings of your abuse. You come near any of us again, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are." The standoff stretched taut as a wire, and Alden could feel the violence hovering in the air like a living thing. His finger rested near the shotgun's trigger, not on it but close. He'd never shot a man in his life, but he would if he had to. He'd made that decision the moment he'd brought these women into his home. Vernon must have seen something in his eyes because he took a step back. "This isn't over," he said. "You think you can hide from me? You think some old man with a gun is going to stop me?" "I think," Alden said quietly, "that you're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of options. And I think you know it. Now get off my property before I forget. I'm a peaceful man." For a long moment, Vernon didn't move. Then, with a curse that would have made a sailor blush, he turned and stalked back to his truck. He slammed the door hard enough that Alden heard it crack, and then the truck was roaring back down the drive, throwing up plumes of snow. No one moved for a full minute after he'd gone. Then Kendra let out a sob and collapsed, Percy catching her before she hit the ground. Bryn was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and Alden realized his own hands were trembling on the shotgun. "Inside," he said. "Now, we need to call the sheriff, the state police, actually. Someone Vernon doesn't have in his pocket." They filed back into the cabin, and Alden locked the door behind them, setting the shotgun within easy reach. Percy had Kendra on the couch, rubbing her hands and speaking to her in low, soothing tones. Bryn was pacing, her nursing training kicking in as she checked her sister for signs of shock. Alden picked up his phone and dialed, his mind already working through what they'd need to do next. Vernon had found them once. He could find them again, which meant they couldn't stay here, not indefinitely. But for tonight, they were safe. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow they'd figure out the next step. Together, the state police took their statements seriously. Two officers arrived the next morning, and Alden watched as Bryn and Kendra recounted years of Vernon's control and intimidation. Percy produced his documentation, text messages, voicemails, even a recording of Vernon threatening to ruin his career if he didn't disappear. The officers took everything, promised to investigate, and warned them that restraining orders took time. "He'll come back before then," Bryn said after they'd left. "You know he will." "Maybe," Alden said. "But now, there's a record. Now he knows we're not just going to roll over." Percy had been quiet since the confrontation, sitting close to Kendra, his hand never leaving hers. Now he spoke up, his voice firm. "We can't stay here. It's not fair to you, Alden, and it's not safe for any of us. I have a friend in Oregon who owns a small farm. He's offered us a place to stay, work if we want it. It's remote, and Vernon doesn't know about it." "When would you leave?" Alden asked, though the question sat heavy in his chest. "As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if the roads are clear enough." Kendra looked stricken. "I don't want to go," she said quietly. "I know we have to, but this place feels like home now." Alden felt something crack inside him. Home. She'd called his cabin home. This place he'd turned into a tomb for his grief. These 3 weeks with them here had reminded him what it meant to have a home instead of just a house. "You'll take the cradle," he said, "and Margaret's recipe box, and anything else you need." "Alden," Bryn started. "No arguments. You're starting a new life. You'll need things. I've got plenty to spare." That afternoon, they began preparing for departure. Percy's car needed checking, supplies had to be gathered, and a route planned that would take them safely to Oregon without risking another encounter with Vernon. Alden worked alongside them, his movements automatic while his mind churned. He found himself in the workshop that evening, running his hand over the cradle he'd built. It had turned out, well, the joints tight, the wood smooth as silk. Margaret would have approved. She'd always said his best work came when he was building something with love instead of just skill. "It's beautiful," Bryn said from the doorway. Alden hadn't heard her approach. "It'll keep the baby safe," he said. "That's what matters. You've kept all of us safe." She came into the workshop, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "I don't know how to thank you for that." "Don't need thanks, just need to know you'll be okay when you leave here." "Will you be okay?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, this strong woman who'd protected her sister through everything, and realized she was worried about him, about what would happen when they were gone and he was alone again. "I've been alone before," he said. "That's not what I asked." Alden was quiet for a long moment. "Your sister said this place felt like home. Truth is, it hasn't felt like home in 5 years. Not until you all showed up. I'd forgotten what that felt like, having people to care for, having a reason to get up, besides just habit." "You could come with us," Bryn said impulsively. "To Oregon. There's room and—" "No," Alden said, but gently. "That's your new start, not mine. But I appreciate the offer." "Then what will you do?" "I'll call my son. Have him visit, maybe more than once a year. I'll stop hiding up here like a hermit and remember that Margaret wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life grieving her." He managed to smile. "You've taught me that much, at least." Bryn's eyes were bright with tears. "You saved our lives. You saved mine too, just in a different way." That night, their last together, Alden made a feast with the best of what he had roasted venison, potatoes with herbs, bread still warm from the oven, and a pie made from the last of his canned apples. They ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing, avoiding the subject of tomorrow's departure. After dinner, Percy helped Alden secure the cradle in the back of his car, wrapping it carefully in blankets. Kendra packed Margaret's recipe box with reverent hands, and Bryn organized the supplies they'd need for the journey. The cabin slowly emptied of the small signs of their presence: Kendra's embroidery, Bryn's books, the extra blankets they'd used. As the evening wore on, Alden pulled out an old camera he'd found in the closet. "We should have a picture," he said. Something to remember this by. They gathered together in front of the fireplace, Alden, Bryn, Kendra and Percy, an unlikely family forged by circumstance and choice. Alden set the timer and hurried to join them, and the flash captured them all smiling, Kendra's hand on her belly and Percy's arm around her shoulders. "I'll mail you a copy," Alden promised, looking at the image on the small screen. "Once you're settled." "You'd better," Kendra said. "And you have to promise to visit when the baby comes. Wild horses couldn't keep me away." Later, lying in his bed for the last time with them under his roof, Alden thought about the strange path that had led them all here. A stranded car in a blizzard, a moment of choice on a dark road. And from that single decision, all of this connection, purpose, hope. Margaret's ring was in his hand again, but this time, when he held it, he didn't feel the crushing weight of loss. He felt gratitude instead for the years they'd had, for the lessons she'd taught him, for the way her love had shaped him into someone who could stop on a snowy road and help strangers in need. "I'm ready to live again," he whispered to her memory. "Thank you for being patient with me while I figured that out." Tomorrow they would leave, and he would be alone again. But not the same kind of alone he'd been before. This time, he'd be alone by circumstance rather than choice. And he'd have the memory of these weeks to remind him that connection was possible, that his heart still worked, that there was still room in his life for other people. It would be enough. It had to be. Morning came too soon and too bright, sunlight streaming through the windows and glinting off the fresh snow. Alden was already up, making coffee and breakfast for the last time. The cabin felt different somehow, as if it knew change was coming and had already started letting go. Percy loaded the car methodically, securing everything so it wouldn't shift during the long drive. The cradle fit perfectly in the back seat, and Alden felt a deep satisfaction seeing it there, knowing it would be used, that it would hold new life and serve its purpose. Kendra was moving slowly this morning, one hand pressed to her lower back. Bryn noticed immediately, her nurse's instincts kicking in. "You okay?" she asked, feeling Kendra's forehead. "Just sore. The baby's been moving a lot, and I didn't sleep well." Kendra managed to smile. "I'm fine, really. Just sad to be leaving." They ate breakfast in near silence, the weight of goodbye settling over them all. Alden had never been good with farewells. He and Margaret had said their goodbye over months as the cancer took her, and he still didn't think he'd done it right. But he tried now, looking at each of them in turn. "You've got my number," he said. "Call when you get there safely. Call if you need anything. Call just to talk. I mean it." "We will," Bryn promised. "And you'd better answer when Paxton calls you. No more hiding." "No more hiding," Alden agreed. Percy shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. For everything. I'll take care of them, I promise." "I know you will. And if you don't, I know where Oregon is." That got a small laugh from everyone, breaking the tension just enough. They moved toward the door, gathering coats and bags, when Kendra suddenly gasped and doubled over. Bryn was at her side instantly. "What is it? What's wrong?" "I don't." Kendra's face had gone pale. "Something's not right. It hurts." "Where?" "Show me where it hurts." Kendra pressed both hands to her belly, her breathing coming fast and shallow. "Low. It's low, and oh God, Bryn, something's wrong." Bryn guided her to the couch, her training taking over. "How long have you been having pain?" "Since last night. I thought it was just from stress." "From—" Another gasp cut off her words. "Those are contractions," Bryn said, her voice tight. "You're in labor." The words hung in the air like a bomb. Percy went white. Alden felt his heart kick into a higher gear, and Kendra started crying. "It's too early," she sobbed. "It's not time yet. The baby's not due for another 6 weeks." "Sometimes babies come early," Bryn said, though Alden could hear the worry underneath her calm tone, "especially after stress. We need to get you to a hospital." "The nearest hospital is 40 minutes away," Alden said. in good conditions. With the snow, it could be over an hour. Then we need to leave now. Percy was already grabbing the keys, his hands shaking. But Kendra cried out again, her body tensing with another contraction. Bryn checked her watch, her expression growing more concerned. "They're 4 minutes apart," she said quietly. "And strong. We might not make it to the hospital in time." "What are you saying?" Percy demanded. "I'm saying we need to prepare for the possibility that this baby is coming here, today, whether we're ready or not." Alden felt the world narrow to this moment. This choice. "What do you need?" he asked Bryn. "Clean sheets, towels, hot water, all the medical supplies we organized. And space. We'll need to turn the bedroom into a delivery room." They moved with controlled urgency, years of training and experience taking over. Alden gathered supplies while Percy stayed with Kendra, holding her hand through contractions that were coming faster now. Bryn converted the spare bedroom into something that looked almost medical, her competence a steadying force in the chaos. "I'm scared," Kendra whimpered between contractions. "What if something goes wrong?" "Nothing's going to go wrong," Bryn said firmly. "I've delivered dozens of babies. You're young, you're strong, and I'm right here. We can do this." "But the baby's early. 6 weeks isn't terrible. Babies born at 34 weeks do well, especially with proper care. And you're getting the best care I know how to give." Another contraction hit, harder than the others, and Kendra screamed. Percy looked like he might pass out, and Alden steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. "She needs you strong right now," Alden said quietly. "You can fall apart later. Right now, you be the man she needs you to be." Percy straightened, wiping his eyes, and nodded. He moved back to Kendra's side, stroking her hair, murmuring encouragements that Alden couldn't quite hear. The contractions intensified, coming one on top of another now. Bryn checked Kendra's progress and looked up at Alden, her expression grave. "This is happening. Fast," she said. "Too fast. Call 911. Get an ambulance started this way, even if they can't get here in time." And then she paused, meeting his eyes. "Then I'm going to need your help. Can you do that?" Alden had built bridges, survived Margaret's death, lived alone in the wilderness for 5 years. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, for the raw reality of new life, forcing its way into the world in his spare bedroom. "Yes," he said simply. "Tell me what to do." And with those words, the final act began. The next 2 hours were the longest of Alden's life. He'd called 911, and the dispatcher had promised an ambulance, but with the snow and the distance, they were at least 45 minutes out. Maybe more. Bryn worked with steady hands and a calm voice that belied the intensity of what was happening, coaching Kendra through each contraction, monitoring the baby's progress. Alden boiled water, brought clean towels, did whatever Bryn asked without question. Percy held Kendra's hand so tightly his knuckles were white, whispering encouragements between her screams. The cabin that had been so quiet for so long now rang with the primal sounds of birth, pain, and effort, and the incredible work of bringing new life into the world. "You're doing so well," Bryn kept saying. "You're so strong, Kendra. Just a little longer." But Alden could see the worry in her eyes when Kendra wasn't looking. Could see the way she kept checking her watch, the way her jaw tightened with each passing minute. Something wasn't going quite right, though she was too professional to say it aloud and scare everyone. "Bryn," Alden said quietly during a brief lull, "what do you need?" She looked at him, and he saw the weight of responsibility in her eyes. "Prayer might be good right about now," she said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Another contraction hit, the strongest yet, and Kendra bore down with a sound that came from somewhere deep and ancient. Bryn moved quickly, her hands sure despite the fear Alden knew she must be feeling. "The baby's crowning," she said. "Kendra, listen to me. On the next contraction, you push with everything you have. Do you understand?" Kendra nodded, her face pale and slick with sweat. Percy was crying openly now, still holding her hand, still there. The contraction came, and Kendra pushed, and Alden had never heard such a sound, part scream, part roar, all determination. Bryn worked with practiced efficiency, supporting the baby's head, checking for the cord, guiding the tiny body out into the world. And then, in a rush of fluid and blood and miracle, the baby was born. The silence that followed was terrifying. The baby wasn't crying. It lay in Bryn's hands, tiny and still, its skin a bluish color that made Alden's heart stop. "Why isn't it crying?" Percy asked, his voice breaking. "Bryn, why isn't the baby crying?" But Bryn was already moving, clearing the baby's airway with practiced motions, rubbing its back, stimulating it to breathe. Seconds stretched into eternities. Kendra was sobbing, reaching for the baby she couldn't yet hold. "Come on," Bryn whispered. "Come on, little one. Breathe for me." Alden found himself praying, really praying for the first time since Margaret's death. Praying to whoever might be listening that this tiny life would take its first breath, that after everything these people had been through, they wouldn't lose this precious thing they'd fought so hard to protect. And then a cough, a sputter, and finally, gloriously, a thin wail that was the most beautiful sound Alden had ever heard. The baby's skin began to pink up, its tiny fists waving in protest at the cold, bright world it had been thrust into. Bryn laughed, tears streaming down her face as she quickly dried the baby and wrapped it in warm towels. "It's a girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have a daughter." She placed the baby on Kendra's chest, and the young woman's sobs turned to laughter as she held her child for the first time. Percy leaned over them both, his hand gentle on the baby's tiny head, his face a mask of wonder and relief. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's absolutely perfect." Bryn finished the delivery with competent efficiency, but Alden could see her hands shaking now that the crisis had passed. He brought her a clean towel, and she wiped her face, taking a moment to steady herself. "You did it," Alden said quietly. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us." The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. The paramedics trudging through the snow to find a healthy baby girl nursing at her mother's breast and a makeshift delivery room that would have made any hospital proud. They checked both mother and baby, pronounced them stable, and prepared to transport them to the hospital for observation. "You did good work here," one of the paramedics said to Bryn. "Real good work." "I had help," Bryn said, glancing at Alden. As they prepared to leave, Kendra looked up at Alden from the stretcher, her daughter cradled in her arms. "Her middle name," she said. "I want it to be Alden. Percy's already agreed. We want her to carry your name, so she'll always remember the man who saved us all." Alden felt his throat close up, unable to speak. He just nodded, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. Her fingers wrapped around his, that instinctive infant grip, and something in his chest that had been closed for 5 years finally opened all the way. "Welcome to the world, little one," he whispered. "You've got a good family waiting to love you." They loaded mother and baby into the ambulance, Percy climbing in beside them. Bryn hugged Alden fiercely before following. "We'll call you," she promised, "as soon as we know they're okay." And then they were gone, the ambulance disappearing down the snowy drive, and Alden stood alone in the sudden silence of his cabin, surrounded by the evidence of what had just happened: bloody towels, rumpled sheets, and the lingering miracle of new life, born in a place that had known too much death. He sat down heavily in his chair, exhausted and exhilarated, and let the tears come at last. 3 months had passed since that snowy morning when a baby girl entered the world in Alden's spare bedroom. Spring had come to the mountains, turning the landscape from white to green, and with it had come changes that Alden was still getting used to. The call from the hospital had come that same evening. Both mother and baby were doing well, no complications despite the early arrival. The baby weighed 5 pounds 3 ounces, and they'd named her Sophie Alden Whitmore. Alden had held the phone long after hanging up, that middle name echoing in his mind like a benediction. They'd stayed in touch, just as promised. Weekly phone calls at first, then video chats once they'd settled into Percy's friend's place in Oregon. Alden got to watch Sophie grow from a tiny, wrinkled newborn into a baby with alert eyes and a surprisingly strong grip. Kendra looked healthier each time he saw her, the fear gone from her eyes, replaced by the exhausted contentment of new motherhood. Percy was clearly besotted with both his daughter and his wife. They'd married in a small ceremony at the courthouse 2 weeks after Sophie's birth. Bryn had found work at a local clinic, and from what Alden could see, she was thriving. The constant vigilance that had marked her time at the cabin had eased, though she still called every Sunday without fail, checking on him as much as he checked on them. Vernon had been arrested 3 weeks after the confrontation at the cabin. The evidence Percy had gathered, combined with statements from Bryn and Kendra and half a dozen other people who'd suffered under his control over the years, had been enough. He was awaiting trial, and his lawyer was already talking about plea deals. The sisters would never have to fear him again, but the biggest change was in Alden himself, and in the cabin that no longer felt like a tomb. Paxton had visited twice already, the second time bringing his girlfriend, a kind woman named Lindsay, who taught elementary school and laughed easily. They'd stayed for a weekend, and Alden had shown them the room where Sophie had been born, told them the whole story. Paxton had listened with wonder, seeing his father in a new light, and when they'd hugged goodbye, it had felt real in a way it hadn't in years. The spare bedroom had been repainted, the medical supplies properly organized, and fresh curtains hung in the windows. Alden found himself keeping it ready now, not as a shrine to what had been, but as a space for what might be. Paxton had already asked about bringing Lindsay back in the summer, maybe staying longer this time. The workshop had new projects in various stages of completion: a rocking horse for Sophie's first birthday, a bookshelf for Bryn's new apartment, a picture frame he'd was carving with mountain scenes for Percy and Kendra. His hands stayed busy, but now it felt like building towards something instead of just filling time. He'd even started volunteering at the local community center 1 day a week, teaching basic woodworking to anyone who wanted to learn. Margaret would have laughed at that, her hermit husband, surrounded by people actually enjoying it, but she would have been proud too. He liked to think she was, wherever she was. The photograph from that last night, the one of all 5 of them together, sat on his mantel now in the frame he'd made. He looked at it often, remembering how scared they'd all been, how uncertain of what came next. They'd been strangers thrown together by circumstance, and somehow they'd become family. On a particularly beautiful spring morning, Alden was working in the garden plot Margaret had planted years ago, turning the soil for the first time since her death, when his phone rang. It was a video call from Kendra. "Alden!" Her face filled the screen, bright with excitement. "We wanted to ask you something." Percy appeared beside her, Sophie cradled in his arms. The baby had grown so much, her eyes following movement now, her little fists grabbing at everything in reach. "We're planning Sophie's baptism," Kendra said. "Next month, here in Oregon. And we were hoping you'd be her godfather. If you want to be, I mean. We know it's a lot to ask." "Yes," Alden said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of course, yes. Really." Kendra's eyes were shining with tears. "Oh, Alden, thank you. It wouldn't feel right without you there. You're the reason we're all together. The reason we're safe. You're the reason I remembered how to live," Alden said simply. "So I think we're even." After the call ended, Alden stood in his garden with dirt on his hands and tears on his face, feeling the sun warm on his shoulders. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, closed off, afraid, hiding from life because he couldn't bear any more loss. And he thought about who he was now, someone who answered phone calls, made plans, looked forward to tomorrow instead of just surviving until it arrived. It hadn't been an easy transformation. There were still hard days when the loneliness crept back in. When he missed Margaret so much, it felt like a physical ache. But now he had people to call, projects to work on, a goddaughter who would grow up knowing his name, and maybe someday understanding what her birth had meant to him. He went back to his work, planting seeds in soil that had lain fallow too long, tomatoes like Margaret used to grow, herbs for cooking, flowers that would bloom in summer and bring color to the clearing. Each seed was a promise, a commitment to being here to see them grow. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Alden sat on his porch with a cup of tea, looking out at the land he'd chosen as his refuge. It was still quiet here, still remote, but it no longer felt like exile. It felt like home again, not despite what had happened here, but because of it. His phone buzzed with a text from Bryn. "Thinking about you today. Hope you're well." He typed back. "Better than well. Planning a trip to Oregon next month. Got a goddaughter to meet properly." Her response came quickly. "She's lucky to have you." "We all are." Alden smiled, pocketed the phone, and watched the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, a family he'd helped save was sitting down to dinner, and a baby girl who carried his name was being rocked to sleep. Somewhere, his son was planning another visit, building bridges Alden had thought burned beyond repair. And here, in this cabin that had witnessed so much sorrow and then such unexpected joy, an old widower was learning that life could surprise you if you let it. That the heart could heal even when you thought it was broken beyond mending. That sometimes the greatest gift you could give was simply showing up when someone needed you. And the greatest gift you could receive was letting someone show up for you. The night air was cool, and Alden pulled his jacket tighter, but he didn't go inside. Not yet. There was still light in the sky, still warmth in his tea, and still so much to look forward to. He sat there until the stars were bright overhead, at peace in a way he hadn't been in years, grateful for the storm that had brought strangers to his door and given him back his life. Tomorrow he'd start packing for Oregon. Tomorrow he'd call Paxton and tell him about becoming a godfather. Tomorrow he'd continue the slow, steady work of living fully instead of just existing. But tonight he simply sat with his memories and his hope, surrounded by the quiet mountains, no longer alone even in his solitude. And that, he thought, was more than enough.